I confess that when I look back upon the extraordinary affair of the Cairo sapphire letters, it is not the glittering jewel itself that first springs to mind, nor even the shocking discovery that would soon shake the foundations of London's most distinguished archaeological circles. Rather, it is the image of my friend Hercule Poirot, standing with characteristic precision before the fireplace of his immaculate flat in Whitehaven Mansions, holding between his thumb and forefinger a sheet of cream-colored paper as though it was some particularly distasteful specimen. The morning fog had settled over London like a grey shroud, and I had called upon Poirot partly from habit and partly from that restless feeling that often drove me to seek his company during the duller months of autumn. His sitting room was, as always, a testament to his obsession with order and symmetry. Every chair positioned with mathematical precision, the mantelpiece arranged with objects spaced at exact intervals, and not so much as a speck of dust daring to disturb the perfect harmony of his domain. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot said without preamble, his green eyes fixed upon the document in his hand. "Here we have a most curious communication. 3 letters, to be precise, each more intriguing than the last. They speak of ancient treasures, of debts that must be paid, and of, how shall I put it, a reckoning that approaches like the shadow of a pyramid at sunset." I set down my teacup with perhaps more force than necessary, causing a small chime from the delicate china. "Letters? From whom?" That, mon ami, is precisely the question that exercises the little grey cells. Poirot moved to his desk, where 2 additional letters lay spread with characteristic neatness. They are addressed to Sir Montague Blackwood, the distinguished Egyptologist, and they arrive unsigned. "But see here," he gestured with one perfectly manicured finger. "The paper is of the finest quality, the handwriting educated, and the postmarks. The postmarks tell a story of their own." I approached to examine the correspondence more closely. The first letter, dated some 3 weeks prior, was brief but ominous. The sacred eye of Isis has been removed from its rightful place. The ancient guardians do not forget. What was taken from the sands of Egypt must return to the sands of Egypt. This is the first warning. The second, arriving a week later, was more specific. The sapphire burns with the fire of divine justice. Sir Montague Blackwood knows the truth of how it came to rest in English hands. The descendants of the tomb builders have not forgotten their heritage. The second warning has been given. The third letter, which had arrived only yesterday, carried an unmistakable note of menace. 3 warnings are given to the defiler of sacred places. The time for warnings has passed. The eye of Isis shall be returned, or the curse of the pharaohs shall claim what justice demands. The blood of the tomb robbers shall water the desert sands. Good heavens, I breathed. These read like something from a sensational novel. Surely Sir Montague doesn't take such theatrical nonsense seriously. Poirot's moustaches twitched with what might have been amusement. Sir Montague, it appears, takes them seriously enough to request the assistance of Hercule Poirot. He telephoned this morning in a state of considerable agitation. It seems that the sapphire in question, a magnificent blue stone known as the Eye of Isis, forms the centerpiece of his private collection. More significantly, he has received information that suggests these letters may not be the work of a harmless crank. What sort of information? Yesterday evening, his house in Belgravia was observed by a man of Middle Eastern appearance who made no attempt at concealment, but simply stood across the street for the better part of an hour, watching the windows. When Sir Montague's butler approached to inquire his business, the man smiled, bowed politely, and walked away without a word. I felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "And Sir Montague wishes you to investigate?" "More than that, mon ami. He wishes me to attend a gathering at his country estate, Ravenscroft Manor in Surrey. He has, with considerable foresight, invited all those persons who might have knowledge of the sapphire's history or reason to desire its return. A house party, you might say. but one with a most serious purpose. Poirot moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street with that peculiar stillness that always preceded his most intense periods of mental activity. The Eye of Isis, according to Sir Montague, was discovered during his expedition to the Valley of the Kings some 15 years ago. It was found in a previously unknown tomb, along with other artifacts of considerable value. The Egyptian authorities of the time permitted its export under the archaeological agreements then in force, but, I prompted. But there were irregularities. Questions about the tomb's location, about certain documentation that was allegedly lost, about payments that may or may not have been made to local officials. Nothing that could be proved, you understand, but enough to create whispers in academic circles. Poirot turned from the window, his expression grave. Sir Montague fears that someone connected with that original expedition has decided to seek, shall we say, private restitution. The house party will include Professor James Whitmore, who led the dig, Dr. Hassan al-Rashid, the Egyptian government representative who supervised the excavation, Miss Catherine Sterling, Sir Montague's secretary and the daughter of his late partner in the expedition, and Captain Ronald Ashford, who provided security for the archaeological team. A gathering of suspects, in other words. Precisely. And you, Hastings, if you are willing, shall accompany me as my colleague and observer. Sir Montague's invitation extends to a companion, and I find that your particular talents for, how shall I put it, providing the common-sense perspective are invaluable in such circumstances. I needed no further encouragement. The prospect of a country house mystery, complete with ancient curses and stolen treasures, appealed to every romantic instinct I possessed. When do we leave? This afternoon. Sir Montague's motor car will collect us at 3 o'clock precisely. Poirot moved toward his bedroom, already mentally preparing for the journey. Pack for 3 days, mon ami, and bring your warmest clothes. Surrey in November can be most inhospitable, and I suspect we shall need all our faculties unimpaired by physical discomfort. As I prepared to depart from my own flat to pack, Poirot called after me. "One moment, Hastings. Observe this curious detail." He held up the third letter, pointing to a small mark in the corner, a tiny hieroglyphic symbol drawn in blue ink. The Eye of Horus, symbol of protection and royal power. Our correspondent, it would seem, possesses at least some knowledge of ancient Egyptian symbolism. A scholar, then? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone who wishes us to believe they are a scholar. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual challenge. We shall see, mon ami. We shall see what secrets lie, buried beneath the respectable facade of English country society. The journey to Ravenscroft, the journey to Surrey, proved uneventful, though I noticed that Poirot spent the entire drive studying a small notebook, occasionally making precise annotations with his fountain pen. Sir Montague had indeed sent his motor car, a magnificent Rolls-Royce driven by a taciturn chauffeur who navigated the fog-shrouded roads with the skill of long practice. Ravenscroft Manor emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic romance. A sprawling Elizabethan structure of weathered stone and mullioned windows, its chimneys disappearing into the grey sky above. Ancient oaks lined the drive, their bare branches forming a natural colonnade that seemed to whisper of secrets and hidden knowledge. Sir Montague Blackwood himself greeted us at the entrance, a tall, spare man in his 60s with iron-grey hair and the weathered complexion of one who had spent years under the Egyptian sun. His handshake was firm, but I noticed a slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of considerable nervous tension. "Monsieur Poirot, Colonel Hastings," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Oxford and the British Museum. "I cannot express how grateful I am that you have come. The situation has become rather more pressing since we spoke this morning." "Indeed." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "What has occurred?" Another letter arrived with the afternoon post. Sir Montague led us into a magnificent entrance hall dominated by glass cases containing Egyptian artifacts. But this one was different. It contained a photograph. He handed Poirot a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a photograph of the Eye of Isis itself, a magnificent sapphire the size of a robin's egg, its deep blue surface seeming to glow within a fire. But what made us both start was the setting. The jewel was photographed not in Sir Montague's collection, but lying upon what appeared to be ancient stone blocks, surrounded by hieroglyphic inscriptions. This photograph was taken in Egypt, Sir Montague said quietly, in the tomb where the sapphire was originally discovered. But that tomb was sealed 15 years ago, and the location was never made public. Whoever took this photograph has access to information that should not exist. Poirot studied the image with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly serious. The shadows in this photograph suggest it was taken recently, within the last few weeks, I would estimate. And see here. He pointed to a corner of the image. Modern electric lighting equipment is visible. Someone has been conducting unauthorized excavations. But that's impossible, Sir Montague protested. The Egyptian authorities would never permit. He stopped, his face paling as the implications struck him. Unless, Poirot said gently, the Egyptian authorities are not aware of these activities, or unless someone with considerable influence has arranged for them to look the other way. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall, and Sir Montague straightened his shoulders with visible effort. The other guests are gathering for tea, he said. Perhaps it would be best if you met them before we discuss this matter further. I fear that among our assembled company, we may find both the victim and the perpetrator of this curious affair. As we followed our host toward the drawing room, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking not merely into a country house gathering, but into a carefully constructed trap. One that had been 15 years in the making, and whose final spring was about to be triggered by forces as ancient and implacable as the pyramids themselves. The Eye of Isis, it seemed, was about to claim its first victim. The drawing room at Ravenscroft Manor embodied the curious marriage of English respectability and Egyptian mystique that seemed to define Sir Montague's entire existence. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows overlooking the misty grounds, while glass cases containing ancient artifacts stood sentinel between overstuffed Victorian furniture. A coal fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across papyrus scrolls mounted in gilt frames, yet the atmosphere remained distinctly chilled. 5 people awaited our arrival, arranged about the room with the careful spacing of chess pieces positioned for an opening gambit. Sir Montague performed the introductions with visible strain, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a host who would rather be anywhere else on earth. Professor James Whitmore dominated the space near the fireplace, a bear of a man whose rumpled tweed suit and ink-stained fingers spoke of decades spent in dusty libraries and excavation sites. His leonine mane of white hair and commanding presence suggested one accustomed to lecture halls, though his sharp blue eyes held a defensive quality that immediately caught my attention. "Monsieur Poirot," he boomed, extending a powerful hand. "Your reputation precedes you, though I confess surprise that Montague felt outside assistance necessary for what amounts to elaborate extortion." His emphasis on the word extortion carried unmistakable disapproval, as though involving a detective somehow diminished their scholarly dignity. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid presented a striking contrast, impeccably dressed in an English suit, yet wearing a crimson fez that proclaimed his heritage. Perhaps 60, with olive skin and intelligent dark eyes that held both wisdom and profound sadness, he bowed slightly with old-world courtesy. "I have followed your cases with great interest, Monsieur Poirot," he said in perfect English, touched with a slight accent. "In Egypt, we understand that truth, like the desert, eventually reveals all that lies buried beneath its surface." His words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and I noticed Professor Whitmore shift uncomfortably. Captain Ronald Ashford stood with the unmistakable bearing of a military man, despite his civilian clothes. Sandy-haired and perhaps 40, with a thin scar along his jawline, He positioned himself to observe both doors and windows simultaneously, the habit of one trained in tactics and survival. Yet there was something guarded in his manner, a tension that spoke of secrets carefully maintained. Miss Catherine Sterling occupied a chair behind the silver tea service, her auburn hair swept into a practical chignon and grey eyes that missed nothing despite her quiet demeanour. Her simple, dark dress spoke of good taste rather than fashion, and her ink-stained fingers marked her as someone who spent hours with documents and correspondence. "My father spoke often of you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending her hand with surprising directness. "He followed your cases with great interest before his death. He would have been pleased to know you were investigating this matter." Something in her voice, a subtle emphasis, suggested layers of meaning I could not quite grasp. Poirot moved to the room's center, his small figure somehow commanding attention despite his diminutive stature. His green eyes traveled methodically from face to face with that peculiar intensity that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "It is fascinating," he murmured, ostensibly to me but loud enough for all to hear, "how a single stone discovered 15 years ago can bring together such a diverse gathering. A professor who seeks truth, a diplomat who pursues justice, a soldier who once provided protection, and a lady who maintains the records, all connected by the eye of Isis." "The eye is more than a stone," Miss Sterling said quietly, her hand trembling slightly as she poured tea. "It carries responsibilities, burdens that Sir Montague has borne longer than anyone knows." "Nonsense, Catherine," Whitmore grunted, refilling his pipe with unnecessary force. "It's a sapphire, a fine one, but merely a rock. This talk of curses has everyone on edge unnecessarily." "Perhaps," Dr. Al-Rashid interjected smoothly, "but in my country we have learned that some burdens transcend generations. What was taken from sacred ground does not rest easily in foreign hands." The tension in the room was palpable now, sharp and electric. Captain Ashford moved closer to the drinks cabinet, his movements betraying nervous energy beneath military discipline. "Superstitious rot," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "We followed all proper procedures during the excavation." "Did we?" Miss Sterling asked quietly, her grey eyes meeting his directly. "Did we really, Captain?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an Egyptian cigarette. Poirot set down his teacup with characteristic precision, having stirred it exactly 3 times clockwise and positioned the handle at the perfect angle. "It is curious," he observed, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "how memory can be as fragile as ancient pottery. Yet sometimes, mes amis, it is not memory that fails us, but conscience that refuses to remain silent." At that moment, a sudden draught swept through the room, extinguishing 2 candles on the mantelpiece and causing the heavy curtains to billow despite the closed windows. In the flickering firelight, shadows danced against the walls like the silhouettes of ancient gods. Poirot moved swiftly to the nearest window, examining the latch with his magnifying glass. When he turned back to face the room, he held a small piece of metal between his fingers. "We are not alone at Ravenscroft," he announced quietly. "This latch has been tampered with from the outside. Someone has been watching us, mes amis. And now, it would seem, they have decided to join our little gathering." The revelation of the tampered window latch sent ripples of unease through the assembled company, each face reflecting a different shade of guilt or fear. Professor Whitmore set down his pipe with trembling fingers, while Captain Ashford instinctively moved toward the windows, his military training asserting itself despite the obvious futility of immediate action. "This changes everything," Dr. Al-Rashid said quietly, his cultured voice heavy with resignation. "For 15 years, I've told myself that our actions in Egypt were justified by academic necessity. But if someone has followed us here, if they have been watching—" He paused, his dark eyes meeting each face in turn. "Then perhaps the time for self-deception has ended." Miss Sterling's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "What do you mean, Doctor?" "I mean my dear young lady, that the documents your father negotiated, the permits that allowed the Eye of Isis to leave Egypt, they were not entirely legitimate. The admission fell like a stone into still water, creating widening circles of shock. Sir Montague lurched forward in his chair. "Hassan, for God's sake—" "No, Montague. We have hidden behind respectability long enough." Dr. Al-Rashid's voice carried the weight of years of suppressed conscience. The official export permit listed the sapphire as a minor ceremonial object of moderate value. In reality, we all knew it was the centerpiece of the tomb, worth more than everything else combined. The Egyptian authorities were encouraged to overlook certain details. Encouraged how? Poirot's question was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. Captain Ashford cleared his throat uncomfortably. There were payments made to certain officials. Standard procedure in those days. Expedition fees, they were called. Nothing illegal, you understand, but sufficient to ensure that inconvenient questions were not asked, Poirot observed. He moved to the center of the room, his small figure somehow commanding despite the tension crackling around him. And now, 15 years later, someone wishes to ask those questions, someone who knows the truth. The letters mentioned descendants of tomb builders, Miss Sterling said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was theatrical nonsense, but if there are families who remember— Professor Whitmore snorted, though the sound lacked conviction. Superstitious rot. This is about money, not ancient grievances. Someone has discovered the sapphire's true value and wants their share. Poirot tilted his head thoughtfully. Perhaps. But consider this curious detail. Our watcher chose to tamper with the window latch rather than simply observe from the grounds. This suggests they wished to hear our conversation, to understand our relationships and our fears. That is not the behavior of a simple extortionist. The small Belgian detective moved toward the fireplace, his eyes scanning the room with methodical precision. Sir Montague, when did you last verify that the Eye of Isis was secure? This morning, Sir Montague replied, his hand moving instinctively to his waistcoat pocket. I always check after receiving one of those damned letters. His face went pale. My key. The key to the display case. I cannot find it. The admission struck the room like a physical blow. Captain Ashford swore under his breath, while Miss Sterling rose from her chair with sudden urgency. When did you notice it missing? Poirot demanded. I'm not certain. This morning, when I went to check the sapphire, I had to ask Barker to open the case with his key. I told myself I'd simply mislaid mine, but now you fear otherwise, Poirot finished. Come, we must verify immediately whether your fears are justified. We moved as a group toward the Egyptian room, the atmosphere thick with dread. Sir Montague's hands shook as he unlocked the heavy door, and I noticed that even Poirot's usual composure seemed strained. The room beyond was a testament to a lifetime of archaeological passion. Glass cases filled with ancient treasures, papyrus scrolls mounted on the walls, and stone statues that seemed to watch our approach with eternal eyes. At the room's center stood an ornate display case, its brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight. The case stood open. The velvet cushion within was empty. Mon Dieu! Poirot breathed, approaching the empty case with careful steps. The Eye of Isis has vanished. But as he bent to examine the display more closely, his sharp eyes caught something the rest of us had missed. Nestled in the corner of the velvet cushion lay a small object, a piece of papyrus, aged and yellowed, with hieroglyphic symbols drawn in fresh ink. Poirot lifted it carefully with his handkerchief. Our thief, he announced, has left us a message. And unless I am very much mistaken, this is not the work of a common criminal, but of someone who understands the true significance of what they have taken. He looked up at our stricken faces, his green eyes gleaming with the light of the hunt. The game, as they say, has begun in earnest. The discovery of the empty case sent shockwaves through our assembled company, each face reflecting a different shade of horror and guilt. Sir Montague gripped the edge of a nearby sarcophagus, his knuckles white against the ancient stone, while Miss Sterling pressed her handkerchief to her lips as though to stifle a cry. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, approaching the violated display with the reverence of one entering a crime scene. "The thief has been most selective. Observe, mes amis, this room contains treasures worth thousands of pounds, yet only the Eye of Isis has been taken. This is not the work of a common burglar seeking quick profit." Dr. Al-Rashid stepped forward, his scholarly instincts overcoming his obvious distress. "The papyrus message, Monsieur Poirot. May I examine it more closely?" Poirot handed him the fragment with characteristic care. The Egyptian diplomat studied the hieroglyphic symbols with practiced eyes, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This speaks of Mahat," he said finally, his cultured voice heavy with significance. "The ancient goddess of truth and justice. The symbols translate roughly as, 'The scales of divine justice demand balance. Let the heart heavy with guilt be weighed against the feather of truth before Ra's chariot rises.'" "The weighing of the heart," Miss Sterling murmured, her classical education evident. "In Egyptian mythology, the hearts of the dead were weighed against Ma'at's feather. If found heavy with sin, the soul was devoured." "Precisely," Dr. Al-Rashid confirmed, "but these hieroglyphs, they are simplified, almost crude. The grammar suggests someone copying from a reference book rather than one truly fluent in the ancient language." Professor Whitmore snorted, though the sound lacked his usual conviction. "Theatrical nonsense designed to frighten us. This is about money, not ancient curses." "Perhaps," Poirot replied, his green eyes scanning the room methodically. "But consider this curious detail. The glass case shows no signs of forced entry. The lock has been opened with a key, not picked or broken. This suggests our thief possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Montague's habits and access to his person." The implication settled over the room like a shroud. Captain Ashford cleared his throat uncomfortably. "You're suggesting one of us took the blasted thing?" "I suggest nothing yet, mon capitaine. I observe, and I deduce." Poirot moved to examine the window, his magnifying glass catching the lamplight. "The latch here has indeed been tampered with, but observe, the disturbance is superficial. This was done to suggest an outside intruder, but the real entry was through the door, using Sir Montague's missing key." He turned to face the assembled suspects, his small figure somehow commanding despite the tension crackling through the room. "I must now ask each of you to account for your movements this afternoon, from 2 o'clock until the present moment." "This is outrageous," Whitmore blustered. "We are your clients, not criminals to be interrogated." "It is precisely because you are my clients that I must protect you from false suspicion," Poirot replied with steel wrapped in silk. "When the police arrive, and they must be summoned, they will ask these same questions with considerably less delicacy." Dr. Al-Rashid spoke first, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "I was in my room writing correspondence to colleagues in Cairo. Letters regarding certain matters of conscience that this affair has stirred. I have no witnesses save my word as a gentleman who has already confessed to one crime of omission." Miss Sterling's grey eyes met Poirot's steadily. "I was working in Sir Montague's study, organizing correspondence and filing the latest threatening letter. The work I completed can be verified if necessary." "I took a constitutional on the grounds," Captain Ashford said, his military bearing stiff. "Needed to clear my head. This whole business has been rather trying. I may have been observed by one of the gardeners near the south lawn." Professor Whitmore's face had grown flushed. "I was in the library, reviewing my expedition notes. Sir Montague had asked me to prepare a detailed account of the sapphire's discovery. The butler brought me tea at 2:30. He can verify my presence." "And you, Sir Montague?" Poirot inquired. "I was meeting with my solicitor in the morning room until 3 o'clock, then came directly to greet you and Colonel Hastings." Sir Montague's voice carried the weight of a man watching his world crumble. Poirot's moustaches twitched thoughtfully. So we have a bedroom, a study, the grounds, a library and a morning room, all separate locations, most without independent verification. Yet someone among you possessed the knowledge and opportunity to take Sir Montague's key and enter this room undetected. He paused, letting his gaze rest on each face in turn. But there is something else, something that troubles the little grey cells. Why leave a message? A professional thief takes the jewel and vanishes. A fanatic might destroy it as a symbol of colonial exploitation. But this thief wants us to know why it was taken. They want us to feel the weight of judgment. You mean, Miss Sterling said quietly, that the sapphire isn't the real objective? Exactement, mademoiselle. The Eye of Isis is bait in a larger trap. Someone believes that among this gathering sits a person whose guilt demands this ancient form of justice. The question that remains is, whose heart will prove heavy when weighed against the feather of truth? The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Each person in the room seemed to be calculating not only their own secrets, but measuring the guilt they perceived in their companions. Outside, darkness was falling over Ravenscroft Manor, and with it came the growing certainty that before dawn broke, the scales of Mat would indeed claim their due. The violation of the Egyptian room had transformed the atmosphere at Ravenscroft Manor from one of genteel tension to barely suppressed panic. Poirot moved with characteristic precision around the empty display case, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail with the methodical care of a surgeon examining a patient. "Observe, mes amis," he said, indicating the velvet cushion where the Eye of Isis had rested. The thief handled the sapphire hastily. "See here, the fabric shows signs of disturbance, yet there are no careful impressions such as one would expect from someone who revered the stone's significance." Dr. Al-Rashid leaned closer, his scholarly instincts overcoming his obvious distress. "You suggest the thief was motivated by something other than religious conviction." "Or perhaps," Professor Whitmore interjected sharply, "they simply wanted what they came for and departed quickly. Not everyone subscribes to mystical reverence for ancient trinkets." The word trinkets struck Dr. Al-Rashid like a physical blow. His carefully maintained composure cracked visibly. "Trinkets? Professor, you spent 3 years excavating that tomb. You catalogued every artifact with meticulous care. And now you dismiss the Eye of Isis as a trinket? I describe its academic value, not some superstitious nonsense about curses." Whitmore shot back, his face reddening. "The problem with you people is that you cannot separate scholarship from sentiment." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like poison. Captain Ashford stepped between the two men, his military training asserting itself. "Gentlemen, please. This accomplishes nothing." Miss Sterling had moved to the window, her slender figure silhouetted against the gathering darkness. "It's already begun," she said quietly. "The weighing of hearts. We're exposing old resentments and buried guilt. Perhaps that's what the thief intended." Poirot's head snapped up at her words, his green eyes gleaming with sudden interest. "Mademoiselle, you possess remarkable insight. Tell me, you have worked closely with Sir Montague's papers for 4 years. Have you discovered anything that might explain why someone would choose this particular method of theft?" Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman struggling with internal conflict. "My father died 3 years after the expedition. Before he died, he made me promise to help Sir Montague protect what they had discovered. He said there were debts that needed to be honored, though he never explained what he meant. And your father seemed troubled in those final years." "Haunted would be more accurate," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had nightmares about the tomb, about eyes watching from darkness, about scales that could not be balanced. 2 weeks before he died, he wrote something in his journal. I found it years later. The eye sees all, and what it sees cannot be hidden forever. We took more than treasure from that tomb." We took the truth and buried it beneath lies and official documents. The revelation struck the room like thunder. Professor Whitmore's pipe clattered to the floor, forgotten. Sir Montague made a strangled sound of protest. What truth? Whitmore's voice had lost all its bluster. What are you talking about, Catherine? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the tense silence. Through the window, we could see the headlights of several motor cars winding up the drive. The police? Sir Montague said unnecessarily, his voice hollow with dread. Poirot moved away from the group, his expression thoughtful. Inspector Morrison from the Surrey Constabulary, he murmured to me. A competent man, though perhaps lacking in imagination. He will focus on the physical evidence, the obvious suspects, the straightforward explanations. And that troubles you? What troubles me, Hastings, is the theatrical nature of this crime. The hieroglyphic message, the symbolic timing, the careful selection of this particular gathering of suspects. It speaks of a mind that thinks in dramatic terms, that wishes to create not merely theft, but revelation. He glanced back at the assembled company, now arranging themselves with the careful positioning of actors preparing for a performance. Someone in this room orchestrated tonight's events with the precision of a stage director. They knew exactly how each player would react, what secrets would emerge under pressure, what old wounds would reopen. The sound of heavy boots on marble announced the police arrival. Poirot straightened his tie with characteristic precision. The official investigation begins now, mon ami. But I suspect that what Inspector Morrison will discover are the clues our true criminal wishes him to find. The real mystery lies not in who took the sapphire, but in why they wanted us to witness its taking. As the study door opened to admit the authorities, I could not shake the feeling that we were all puppets in some elaborate performance, dancing to music only the puppet master could hear. Inspector Morrison proved to be exactly the sort of methodical, unimaginative policeman that Poirot had described. A man who approached crime with the straightforward efficiency of a military drill. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and the air of one who regarded subtlety as an unnecessary complication, he surveyed the Egyptian room with the satisfaction of a man confronting a puzzle with clearly defined parameters. "Right then," he announced, consulting his ever-present notebook. "We have a valuable sapphire, stolen from a locked case, with no signs of forced entry. That narrows our field considerably to those with access to Sir Montague's keys and knowledge of the house layout." His gaze swept over the assembled suspects with practiced efficiency. "I'll need detailed statements from each of you, accounting for your whereabouts between 2 and 5 o'clock this afternoon. We'll conduct proper interviews in Sir Montague's study, one at a time." The interviews proceeded with methodical thoroughness. Professor Whitmore's testimony revealed barely concealed resentment beneath his academic dignity. When Morrison pressed him about his relationship with Sir Montague, the professor's composure cracked slightly. "There have been disagreements over attribution and methodology," he admitted, his fingers drumming nervously on the chair arm. "Sir Montague felt his financial backing entitled him to first authorship on our papers. I disagreed. 15 years of collaboration, and he still treats me as a hired consultant rather than a partner." Captain Ashford's military bearing served him well under questioning, though I noticed his answers carried the precision of a man accustomed to official scrutiny. When Morrison asked about his security duties during the original expedition, however, something shifted in his expression. "I protected the dig site and transport convoys," he said carefully. "My job was to ensure the team's safety and prevent theft by local opportunists." "And did you prevent all theft, Captain?" The question hung in the air like incense. Ashford's jaw tightened visibly. "I executed my duties to the best of my ability under difficult circumstances. If you're suggesting otherwise, I'm establishing facts, nothing more." Dr. Al-Rashid's interview proved the most revealing. The Egyptian diplomat spoke with the weight of a man finally unburdening himself of a long-carried secret. "I was young and ambitious 15 years ago," he said, his dignity intact despite the confession. "When certain irregularities in the export documentation were suggested, I convinced myself they were standard diplomatic accommodations. I've spent 15 years regretting that decision." Morrison leaned forward. "What sort of irregularities?" The sapphire's value was significantly understated in official reports. Certain ritual objects that should have remained in Egypt were reclassified as personal effects. I signed documents I knew to be misleading. He met Morrison's gaze directly. "I have no excuse beyond youth and ambition. If someone now seeks to reclaim what was improperly taken, I cannot say they lack justification." Miss Sterling's interview revealed unexpected steel beneath her quiet exterior. She described her work with professional competence, but when Morrison questioned her about her father's role, her composure wavered. "My father handled the financial arrangements and negotiations with local authorities," she said carefully. "After his death, I felt obligated to continue his work, to protect what they had built together." "Protect it from what, Miss Sterling?" "From those who would misunderstand their methods, from those who would judge their actions by modern standards rather than the practices of their time." With the interviews complete, Morrison ordered a systematic search of the guest rooms. "Standard procedure," he announced. "We'll find the sapphire, and that will tell us our thief." As the constables began their methodical work, Poirot drew me aside to the library. The room was shadowed and quiet, filled with volumes on archaeology and ancient history. The inspector proceeds with admirable energy but predictable direction, Poirot murmured, examining a shelf of books on Egyptian excavations. "He looks for the sapphire, but the sapphire, Hastings, is merely the catalyst for something far more complex." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted from the guest wing. A constable appeared in the doorway, holding something wrapped in a handkerchief. "Inspector, found this hidden in one of the rooms." Morrison strode forward, peeling back the cloth to reveal a small velvet pouch. He upended it, and the eye of Isis tumbled out, its deep blue surface gleaming malevolently in the lamplight. "Excellent work, Constable. In whose room?" "Dr. Al-Rashid's, sir, hidden beneath his prayer rug, wrapped in this pouch." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. All eyes turned to the Egyptian diplomat, who stood motionless, his face cycling through shock, understanding, and finally resignation. "It is a plant," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I did not take the stone." "They all say that," Morrison replied with grim satisfaction. "Dr. Al-Rashid, I'm arresting you for the theft of the Eye of Isis. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." "Wait!" Miss Sterling's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood abruptly, her face pale but determined. "He couldn't have put it there. I saw him in the garden during the time the theft occurred. From the study window, he was walking on the terrace, never near the house." Morrison's confident expression faltered. "You said earlier you were in Sir Montague's study the entire afternoon." "I was, but I could see the gardens clearly. Dr. Al-Rashid was visible for most of the time in question." The inspector looked from the stone to the woman to the accused man, his simple narrative crumbling before his eyes. "Then how did it get in his room?" Poirot stepped forward, his small figure somehow commanding despite the chaos around him. "Because, Inspector, someone wished for it to be found there. Someone who understood that Dr. Al-Rashid was the perfect scapegoat, a foreigner who had spoken openly of returning the stone to Egypt, a man whose conscience was already burdened with guilt." He approached the evidence table and picked up the sapphire, holding it up to the lamplight with characteristic precision. After a moment of intense examination, his expression changed dramatically. "But there is a far more significant problem, Inspector. This stone is not the Eye of Isis." Gasps echoed around the room. Sir Montague snatched the jewel from Poirot's hands, examining it frantically with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his waistcoat. "Mon Dieu, he's correct," Sir Montague whispered, his face going ashen. "The natural inclusion, the tiny flaw that makes the eye unique. It's missing. This is paste. Excellent quality, but glass nonetheless." The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Professor Whitmore sank into a chair, while Captain Ashford moved instinctively toward the windows as though preparing for siege. Poirot's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "So we have a theft that is not a theft, planted evidence pointing to an innocent man, and a priceless sapphire that has been replaced by clever forgery. The question that now presents itself is this: when was the real Eye of Isis stolen? Was it today, or has it been missing for much longer than any of us suspected?" He turned to face the assembled suspects, his green eyes gleaming with the light of the hunt. "I suggest, mes amis, that we are not dealing with simple theft, but with something far more complex, a crime that may have been years in the planning, and whose true objective is not the sapphire itself, but something infinitely more valuable." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibilities, each face in the room reflecting a different shade of fear, guilt, or dawning comprehension. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows like skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the depths of Ravenscroft Manor, the real game was only just beginning. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "If this isn't the real stone, then where is it?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic and slightly chilling. "That, Inspector, is precisely the question our true criminal wishes us to ask. For in seeking the answer, we may discover that the Eye of Isis was never the prize at all, merely the bait in a trap that has been 15 years in the making." The revelation that the recovered sapphire was merely an elaborate forgery sent shockwaves through the assembled company, transforming what had appeared to be a solved case into something far more sinister. Inspector Morrison's methodical confidence crumbled visibly as he stared at the paste jewel, his notebook suddenly seeming inadequate for the complexities now facing him. "This changes everything," he muttered, his frustration palpable. "If the real stone wasn't stolen today, then when, and why stage this elaborate performance with planted evidence?" Poirot moved to the window, his small figure outlined against the gathering darkness. His hands were clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose that signaled intense mental activity, while his green eyes reflected the firelight with an almost predatory gleam. "The little gray cells, they whisper of deception within deception," he said quietly. "Consider, mes amis, threatening letters arrive over 3 weeks, building fear and anticipation. A gathering of suspects is carefully arranged. A theatrical theft is staged with precision worthy of the West End. And finally, evidence is planted to implicate the most obvious scapegoat." He turned to face the room, his gaze moving methodically from face to face. But what if the real crime occurred not today, but months, perhaps years, ago? What if someone discovered that the Eye of Isis in Sir Montague's collection was already a forgery, and decided to use that knowledge for purposes of justice or revenge? Sir Montague's weathered face had gone grey as ancient parchment. He lowered himself into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose world was collapsing around him. "Impossible. I examine the collection regularly. I would have noticed such a substitution." "Would you?" Miss Sterling's voice carried a new edge of uncertainty. "Sir Montague, when did you last have the sapphire professionally analyzed rather than simply admired through glass?" The silence that followed was damning in its completeness. Finally, Sir Montague spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The insurance appraisal. 2 months ago, the underwriters insisted on updated valuations. Mr. Cyrus Vane, from a reputable London firm, spent considerable time with the collection." "And the procedures during this examination?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "Standard precautions. Barker supervised throughout, or—" Sir Montague hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. "There was a brief period when Barker was called away to handle an urgent delivery. Captain Ashford kindly stepped in to maintain supervision. All eyes turned to Captain Ashford, who stood near the window with rigid military bearing. His jaw tightened visibly under the scrutiny. I watched that appraiser like a hawk. He never touched anything without gloves, never placed anything in his pockets. Suggesting I was complicit in some switch? I suggest nothing yet, mon capitaine, Poirot replied smoothly. I merely note opportunities and possibilities. But let us consider an even more intriguing scenario. He moved to the center of the room, commanding attention despite his diminutive stature. What if the substitution occurred not in England, but in Egypt itself? What if the real Eye of Isis never left the tomb at all? Dr. Al-Rashid straightened as though struck by lightning. In my country, there are families who have perfected the art of copying ancient treasures over many generations. Master craftsmen who could create replicas virtually indistinguishable from originals without sophisticated gemological analysis. Exactly so, Poirot agreed. And if such a substitution occurred during the original excavation, in the chaos of cataloguing hundreds of artifacts, with local workers handling the transport, with complex chains of custody through Egyptian customs and British shipping, it might have remained undetected for 15 years. Professor Whitmore, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly surged to his feet, his face flushed with anger or fear. That's preposterous. I personally supervised every aspect of the packing and documentation. Every piece was catalogued, photographed, and secured under my direct oversight. Did you? Poirot's voice carried silk wrapped around steel. Or did you supervise what you believed to be the authentic artifacts? Tell me, Professor, in the final days before departure, when the pressure was greatest and the work most rushed, who had access to the treasures after your final inspections? The question opened floodgates of accusation and counter-accusation. Captain Ashford described security protocols while admitting that local workers had been employed for heavy lifting. Dr. Al-Rashid spoke of the complex documentation process through multiple government offices. Miss Sterling revealed that her father had personally handled financial transactions and shipping arrangements. Through it all, Poirot listened with that peculiar stillness that preceded his most brilliant insights. When the voices finally subsided, he spoke with quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. We have been asking the wrong questions entirely. The mystery is not who stole the Eye of Isis today, but whether the Eye of Isis was ever truly here at all. Someone among you has carried this secret for 15 years, watching Sir Montague build his reputation on a foundation of lies, waiting for the perfect moment to... His words were cut short by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside. The library doors burst open to reveal Barker, the usually unflappable butler, his face pale as death and his breath coming in gasps. "Sir Montague, Inspector, you must come immediately. It's Professor Whitmore." We followed him in a rush down the corridor to the professor's ground-floor suite. The door stood ajar, revealing a scene of chaos within. Papers were scattered across every surface. Drawers had been pulled out and overturned. Books lay open and abandoned. But it was the sight in the center of the room that brought us to a horrified standstill. Professor Whitmore slumped in his leather armchair, his breathing shallow and labored, his face gray and clammy with perspiration. On the small table beside him sat a half-empty glass of brandy and a small empty vial that gleamed ominously in the lamplight. "He's been poisoned," Miss Sterling cried, rushing to his side with instinctive compassion. Poirot was there instantly, his small hands checking the professor's pulse while his sharp eyes examined the victim's condition with clinical precision. "He lives, but barely. Hastings, telephone for an ambulance immediately. Inspector, secure that glass and vial. Touch nothing else." As I ran to the hall telephone, my mind raced with implications. Suicide born of guilt, or attempted murder to silence a dangerous witness. The timing seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. When I returned, Poirot was kneeling beside the unconscious professor, carefully collecting samples of white powder from the table surface into a small envelope. The ambulance had been summoned, but the atmosphere in the room was thick with dread and barely suppressed panic. Whatever substance was in that vial acted with considerable swiftness, Poirot observed grimly. But observe this curious detail. There is no suicide note visible. Yet look at his hands. We looked. Professor Whitmore's fingertips were stained with fresh ink, and a crumpled sheet of paper lay beneath his fallen chair. Poirot smoothed it out with infinite care, revealing writing that grew increasingly erratic toward the bottom. Montague. I can no longer carry this burden of guilt. The letters spoke truth. We disturbed things that should have slept in eternal peace. The sapphire was never ours. Two seeds, take. The blood of innocence stains our hands. I have decided to end this torment before. The sentence trailed off into an illegible scrawl, the pen having apparently fallen from nerveless fingers. A confession? Inspector Morrison asked, reading over Poirot's shoulder with evident relief. Guilt over the theft drove him to suicide. Or, Poirot said softly, his voice carrying dangerous certainty, someone wished it to appear so. Observe the position of the pen on the floor. It lies to his left, yet Professor Whitmore is right-handed. The ink stains are on his right hand, consistent with writing, but see this smear on the paper? It runs from left to right, suggesting the document was pulled away while the ink remained wet. He stood, his expression hardening with each deduction. This was no suicide, Inspector. Professor Whitmore was writing this letter under duress, perhaps at gunpoint, perhaps with a blade at his throat. When he had written sufficient text to serve his attacker's purpose, he was silenced with whatever poison filled that vial. But who would do such a thing? Sir Montague whispered, staring at his colleague with horror and dawning comprehension. Someone who realized that Professor Whitmore was the weakest link in a chain of silence that has held for 15 years, Poirot replied. Someone who feared what secrets the professor might reveal under pressure. The theft of the sapphire was merely the opening gambit. Now, the systematic elimination of witnesses has begun. At that moment, a tremendous crash echoed from the conservatory. The sound of breaking glass followed immediately by running footsteps on the gravel drive outside. "The Watcher!" Captain Ashford shouted, his military instincts taking control. "He's still here!" He was already moving toward the French doors that led to the garden. "Wait, Captain!" Poirot's warning came too late. Ashford had already plunged through the doors into the darkness beyond. "Inspector, your constables," Poirot commanded with sharp authority. "Surround the grounds immediately, but exercise extreme caution. We are no longer dealing with a mere thief, but with someone who has already attempted murder once tonight." As the police rushed into the November darkness, their lanterns casting wild shadows across the grounds, Poirot turned back to the unconscious professor. His face was grave as he checked the man's pulse again. "We must pray that James Whitmore survives this night, Hastings, for I suspect he holds the key not merely to the missing sapphire, but to a secret far darker, a secret that someone has already killed to protect and will kill again to keep buried." He looked up at me, his green eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of emerald ice. "The psychological game is finished, mon ami. What began as an elegant puzzle of motive and opportunity has become a desperate fight for survival. Before this night ends, I fear the scales of Maat will demand their full measure of blood." Outside, shouts echoed through the darkness as the hunt began in earnest, while inside Ravenscroft Manor, ancient secrets stirred like disturbed serpents, ready to strike at anyone who dared uncover the truth buried 15 years ago in the sands of Egypt. The chaos following Captain Ashford's impulsive pursuit transformed Ravenscroft Manor into a battlefield between order and pandemonium. Inspector Morrison's constables spread across the grounds like hunting hounds, their lanterns creating dancing pools of light in the November darkness, while inside the house, the remaining suspects huddled together with the nervous energy of prey, sensing an unseen predator. Poirot stood at the shattered conservatory doors, examining the pattern of broken glass with his characteristic precision. The shards glittered like malevolent stars at his polished shoes, and his sharp eyes noted every detail of the destruction. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured as I joined him. "The glass falls inward, not outward. Our intruder broke through from outside, yet the timing suggests this was no desperate escape, but a calculated diversion." Captain Ashford returned moments later, his face flushed with exertion and frustration, accompanied by two constables who shook their heads in silent negation. "Lost him in the woods beyond the south lawn," he reported, his military bearing unable to disguise his anger at failure. Whoever it was knew the grounds intimately, moved through the darkness without hesitation, following what seemed to be a memorized route. "And what did you observe of this mysterious figure during your pursuit?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "Medium height, dark clothing, moved with considerable agility, could have been male or female in the darkness." Ashford paused, his expression troubled. But there was something familiar about the way they moved, the rhythm of their stride. Efficient, economical, no wasted motion. The gait of someone accustomed to carrying heavy loads over rough terrain. The village doctor chose that moment to enter, pulling off his gloves with the grave expression of one who had wrestled with death and achieved only a temporary victory. "Professor Whitmore is alive, but barely," he announced. "Some form of alkaloid poison, carefully administered. I've given him emetics and stimulants, but his survival remains uncertain." "Carefully administered?" Poirot's eyebrows rose sharply. "You are certain of this, Doctor?" "The dosage was precise, enough to incapacitate and create the appearance of fatal poisoning, but not quite enough to ensure death. Someone with medical knowledge calculated this very carefully indeed." Dr. Al-Rashid shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I have medical training from Cambridge," he admitted, "but I'm not the only person present with such knowledge." "Indeed not," Poirot agreed, his gaze moving methodically around the room. "But let us consider another curious detail." He moved to examine a photograph on the mantelpiece, a faded image of the original expedition team standing before the entrance to a tomb. This photograph was taken 15 years ago, yet I count 6 people in the image. We have Sir Montague, Professor Whitmore, Dr. Al-Rashid, Captain Ashford, and Mr. Sterling, Miss Catherine's father. But who is this 6th figure, standing slightly apart from the others? We all crowded around the photograph. The 6th person was indeed present, positioned at the edge of the frame as though reluctant to be included, their face partially obscured by shadow. Sir Montague's face went ashen as recognition dawned. Good God! I had forgotten entirely. That's Barker, my butler. He was our expedition photographer and general assistant before entering my service here in England. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Barker, the invisible servant who moved through the house like a ghost, who had access to every room and every secret, who had supervised the insurance appraisal when the sapphire might have been switched. Where is Barker now? Poirot's voice carried deadly urgency. Inspector Morrison was already moving toward the servants' quarters, returning moments later with grim news. His room is empty. Bed hasn't been slept in. The other servants say he left shortly after the ambulance departed, claiming he needed medical supplies from the village. He is not returning, Poirot said with certainty. Captain Ashford, the movement pattern you found familiar. It was Barker's gait, was it not? The stride of a man who spent years carrying photographic equipment across desert sands. Miss Sterling, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, suddenly produced a worn leather journal from her handbag. There's something else you should know. My father kept a private diary during the expedition. The final entry describes something he called the unforgivable sin. He wrote that if the truth ever emerged, it would destroy them all. Poirot took the journal with reverent care, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting with intense concentration. As he read, his expression transformed, the pieces of an impossibly complex puzzle clicking into place behind his green eyes. Mes amis, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of terrible revelation, We have been investigating the wrong crime entirely. The theft of the Eye of Isis is merely the symptom of a far deeper wound." He closed the journal with deliberate precision. "The sapphire is not simply a jewel. According to Mr. Sterling's notes, it functions as a key, a physical mechanism designed to unlock a hidden chamber within the original tomb. The expedition didn't just loot artifacts. They discovered the entrance to the legendary treasury of Thutmose, but they needed the Eye of Isis to access it." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Dr. Al-Rashid's face went pale as understanding dawned. "The texts spoke of a hidden treasury. We never found it because we assumed the references were metaphorical. But someone realized the truth," Poirot continued. "Someone stole the real sapphire months ago, replacing it with a forgery to buy time. Time to return to Egypt, to locate the tomb, to claim the greatest archaeological prize in history." "Barker," Sir Montague whispered. "He had access during the insurance appraisal. He could have made the switch then." "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "But consider this. The threatening letters were not directed at Sir Montague as victim, but as warning to the true thief. Someone else discovered the plan and demanded their share. When negotiations failed, they chose exposure over exclusion." "Blackmail among thieves," Inspector Morrison muttered. "Precisely. And when the blackmailer pushed too hard, the thief struck back. Professor Whitmore was silenced not because he was guilty, but because he had discovered who possessed the real sapphire." Poirot moved to the window, staring out into the darkness where police lanterns bobbed like fireflies. "Barker has spent 15 years in this house, invisible and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to claim his prize. But someone, perhaps Professor Whitmore, perhaps another member of the expedition, threatened to expose him before he could complete his plan." He turned back to face us, his expression grave. "The scales of Ma'at demand balance, mes amis. But the question that remains is whether justice will be served by law or by the ancient judgment that has already claimed one victim and threatens to claim more." Outside, the wind howled around the manor like the voices of disturbed spirits, and I felt with growing certainty that the final confrontation was drawing inexorably near. The Eye of Isis might be gone, but its curse was far from finished with the living. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "I suggest you expand your search beyond the estate, for I fear that before dawn breaks, we shall discover that the greatest theft in archaeological history has already been completed, and the true treasure of the pharaohs has vanished into the darkness forever." The silence that followed was profound and ominous, broken only by the distant sound of searching voices carried on the November wind. Somewhere in that darkness, ancient secrets moved toward their final reckoning, and the scales of divine justice prepared to claim their due from the living and the dead alike. The long night at Ravenscroft Manor settled into an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the very walls. Inspector Morrison's constables continued their systematic search of the grounds, but their calls grew more distant and less frequent as the November fog thickened around the estate. Inside the drawing room, where the assembled suspects waited with the brittle tension of actors who had forgotten their lines but knew the final curtain was approaching. Poirot moved with deliberate precision around the room, his small figure commanding attention despite the chaos that had engulfed the investigation. His green eyes held that peculiar intensity that always preceded his most brilliant deductions, and I could sense the little gray cells working with mechanical efficiency to arrange the scattered pieces of an impossibly complex puzzle. The psychology of deception. "There is one matter," he said at length, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "which has troubled me from the beginning, though I did not at first understand why. It is a matter of words, of psychology, of the exact flavor of human intention." He moved to stand before Sir Montague, his gaze unwavering. "Your threatening letters, monsieur. Not merely their content, but their very essence. Consider the language employed. Descendants of the tomb builders, the curse of the pharaohs, the blood of tomb robbers. Highly theatrical, is it not? Melodramatic nonsense, Inspector Morrison muttered, consulting his ever-present notebook. Precisely, Poirot agreed with a slight nod. But here lies the curious detail that has exercised the little grey cells. The true zealot, the genuine fanatic driven by religious conviction or ancestral duty, such a person does not write like a character from a sensational novel. They speak with the voice of the righteous, the injured party seeking justice. Yet these letters delight in theatrical menace, in the imagery of curses and ancient vengeance. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room like dust on forgotten artifacts. The author of these communications knew their audience intimately. They understood that Sir Montague, with his lectures on wireless programs about ancient curses and his popular books about the dangers of disturbing the dead, would be particularly susceptible to such atmospheric threats. Miss Sterling's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with trembling fingers. "Are you suggesting the letters were written by someone in this house?" "I'm suggesting, mademoiselle, that they were written by someone who possessed intimate knowledge not only of Sir Montague's psychological vulnerabilities, but also of the original expedition's secrets. Observe this curious detail. The reference to descendants of the tomb builders is not a phrase one encounters in guidebooks or popular literature. It appears in only one source, Professor Whitmore's unpublished monograph on the Valley of the Kings, a draft that exists solely in Sir Montague's private library. The Hidden Chamber. Dr. Al-Rashid leaned forward with scholarly intensity. If the letter writer had access to Sir Montague's private papers, they would have discovered other secrets as well. The expedition records, the architectural drawings, the financial arrangements. "Exactly so," Poirot replied, moving toward the door with sudden purpose. "Inspector, I believe we must examine Sir Montague's study immediately. There is evidence there that will illuminate the true scope of this conspiracy." We ascended to the second floor as a group, the atmosphere thick with anticipation and dread. Sir Montague's private study proved to be a scholar's sanctuary. Leather-bound volumes reaching to the ceiling, filing cabinets arranged with military precision, and a massive desk covered with maps and archaeological diagrams. Poirot moved directly to the expedition files, his fingers dancing across the documents with practiced efficiency. As he spread the architectural drawings across the desk, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Observe these measurements, mes amis," he said, pointing to notations in faded pencil. "The dimensions of the burial chamber do not correspond to the wall measurements recorded here. There is a discrepancy of nearly 3 meters, space unaccounted for in the official documentation." Captain Ashford, his military engineering training evident, studied the drawings with professional interest. "Either the measurements are incorrect, or there's a hidden space behind this wall, a secret chamber." "The legendary treasury of Thutmose," Dr. Al-Rashid breathed, his voice heavy with awe and dread. The texts spoke of treasures hidden where only the worthy could find them. We assumed it was metaphorical, but if the Eye of Isis serves as a key, then whoever possesses both the sapphire and the location of this chamber controls archaeological wealth beyond imagination, Poirot finished. He rifled through the remaining documents with increasing urgency. But the detailed map showing the chamber's location and the mechanism for entry, it is not here. Miss Sterling's face had gone pale as parchment. "My father kept certain documents separate from the official files. He said they were too dangerous to leave in normal archives. There was a private safe in our London residence, which Barker would have known about," Poirot said grimly. "Inspector, we must contact the London police immediately. If Barker has obtained both the sapphire and the map." The fatal discovery. His words were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor. A constable burst through the door, his face flushed with exertion and his breath coming in gasps. "Inspector, we've found something in the woods. You must come immediately." We followed him into the November darkness, our lanterns casting wild, dancing shadows across the frost-touched grounds. The constable led us to a clearing perhaps half a mile from the manor, where several officers stood in a tight circle around something that made my blood run cold. Barker's body lay crumpled against an ancient oak, his face frozen in an expression of shock and betrayal. Even in death, the faithful butler who had served Sir Montague for 15 years retained that dignity that had made him nearly invisible to his social superiors. "Stabbed once through the heart," the police surgeon announced after his preliminary examination. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. The weapon appears to be a thin blade, precisely placed by someone with anatomical knowledge. Poirot knelt beside the body with characteristic care, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of the scene. The dead man's pockets had been systematically searched, their contents scattered across the frozen ground. A wallet, a pocket watch, loose change, but nothing of real significance. "The sapphire is not here," Poirot observed, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Nor any map or documents. Our thief has been robbed by someone even more ruthless and determined." "But who else knew about Barker's plan?" Inspector Morrison demanded, his frustration evident in every word. "Someone who has been orchestrating this entire affair from the shadows," Poirot replied, his voice carrying terrible certainty. "Someone who sent those threatening letters, not to Sir Montague as victim, but to flush out the true thief. Someone who understood that Barker would eventually make his move and who was prepared to intercept him with lethal efficiency. The web of guilt." As we returned to the manor, Poirot's demeanor grew increasingly somber. The discovery of Barker's murder had transformed the investigation from a genteel puzzle into something far more dangerous and immediate. "The pattern becomes clear," he said as we gathered once more in the drawing room. "We have been pursuing shadows while the real criminal manipulated events with the precision of a master puppeteer. The theft was staged, the evidence planted, the confusion orchestrated, all to create the perfect opportunity for murder and theft." He moved to the center of the room, his small figure somehow commanding absolute attention despite the chaos surrounding us. "Consider the sequence of events. Threatening letters create an atmosphere of fear and justify extraordinary security measures. A house party is arranged, bringing together all those with knowledge of the sapphire's true significance. A theatrical theft is staged, complete with planted evidence and convenient scapegoats. And finally, when the true thief emerges from hiding, he is eliminated with surgical precision." Miss Sterling's grey eyes reflected the firelight like chips of flint. "You're suggesting that someone in this room planned Barker's murder?" "I am suggesting, mademoiselle, that someone in this room has been planning far more than murder. They have been orchestrating the perfect crime, one that would eliminate their rivals, claim the greatest archaeological prize in history, and leave them free to enjoy their spoils without fear of exposure." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of wind rattling the windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. Each face in the room reflected a different shade of fear, guilt, or dawning comprehension as Poirot's words settled over them like a shroud. "Tomorrow morning," he announced with quiet authority, "I will require you all to assemble in the Egyptian room. There, beneath the watchful eyes of the ancient gods whose treasures you have coveted, we shall weigh the hearts of the living against the feather of truth. For I know now who wrote those letters, who staged tonight's deceptions, and who murdered both Professor Whitmore and faithful Barker in pursuit of a prize that has already claimed too many lives." He looked from face to face, his green eyes gleaming with the light of absolute certainty. "The scales of Ma'at demand their due, mes amis, and before the sun rises over Surrey, divine justice will finally claim its ancient debt from the guilty." Outside, the November wind rose to a howling crescendo, and somewhere in that darkness, the eye of Isis waited to reveal its final secret to whoever proved worthy, or ruthless enough, to claim it. The game was nearly finished, but the most dangerous moves were yet to be played. The pale November sun cast long shadows across the Egyptian room as we assembled for what I sensed would be the final act of this extraordinary drama. Poirot stood before the empty display case with characteristic precision, his small figure commanding absolute attention despite the gravity surrounding us. The ancient artifacts seemed to watch our gathering with eternal patience, as though they had witnessed such human follies countless times across the millennia. Inspector Morrison had positioned his constables at every entrance, their presence a stark reminder that we were no longer guests, but suspects in a double murder investigation. Sir Montague appeared to have aged a decade overnight, while Dr. Al-Rashid maintained his dignity despite the ordeal of false accusation. Captain Ashford's military bearing seemed diminished by exhaustion, and Miss Sterling sat quietly near the windows, her grey eyes watchful and composed. The architecture of deception. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. We have witnessed a crime of extraordinary sophistication, not merely theft or murder, but a psychological masterpiece designed to manipulate every participant like pieces on a chessboard. The threatening letters, the staged theft, the planted evidence, all orchestrated by someone who understood intimately the fears, guilt, and weaknesses of every person in this room. He moved to examine the empty case once more, his fingers tracing its brass fittings with delicate precision. Consider the curious nature of those letters. They quoted from Professor Whitmore's unpublished monograph, referenced Sir Montague's own lectures about curses and divine justice, and employed the specific theological language of Mahat's judgment. This required not merely academic knowledge, but intimate familiarity with the psychological vulnerabilities of the intended victims. But who among us possessed such comprehensive knowledge? Dr. Al-Rashid asked quietly. Someone who had spent years organizing Sir Montague's papers, handling correspondence, managing financial records, and, most significantly, someone who had access to her father's private journals documenting the expedition's darkest secrets. Poirot's gaze settled on Miss Sterling with inexorable certainty. The web of evidence. Miss Sterling's composure remained intact, though I noticed her hands tighten slightly on the arms of her chair. "This is speculation, Monsieur Poirot. I am a secretary, nothing more." "You are far more than that, mademoiselle," Poirot replied with steel wrapped in silk. "You are the architect of this entire tragedy. The evidence is quite conclusive, though expertly concealed." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small magnifying glass. "Inspector Morrison's men discovered something most interesting in your room this morning, a blotter bearing the reversed impressions of handwritten text. When held to a mirror, the words become quite legible. The sacred eye of Isis has been removed from its rightful place." The revelation struck the room like thunder. Miss Sterling's carefully maintained mask began to crack as Poirot continued his methodical demolition of her defenses. But perhaps more damning still is this curious detail, the expedition filing system in Sir Montague's study. You reorganized it completely 4 months ago, creating new categories and cross-references. Among these new files, Inspector Morrison found something extraordinary. He nodded to the inspector, who produced a manila folder from his briefcase. Hidden within the official correspondence, filed under miscellaneous Egyptian artifacts, we discovered the real Eye of Isis, along with detailed maps showing the location of the hidden treasury. Morrison opened the folder, revealing the magnificent sapphire that seemed to burn within a fire, despite the gray morning light. The psychology of vengeance. Sir Montague gasped, staring at the jewel with a mixture of awe and horror. "But how? When did you—" "The substitution occurred during the insurance appraisal 2 months ago," Poirot explained. Miss Sterling had discovered Barker's earlier theft and replacement of the stone with a forgery. But rather than expose him, she saw an opportunity for something far more elaborate. She allowed Barker to believe his deception remained undetected while she planned her own form of justice. Miss Sterling finally spoke, her voice carrying a new edge of defiance. My father died consumed by guilt over what they did in Egypt. He wrote obsessively about debts that could never be repaid, about treasures stolen from the dead, while Sir Montague built his reputation and fortune on those crimes. We were left with nothing but shame and poverty. So you decided to become the instrument of divine justice, Poirot observed. You wrote the threatening letters to create an atmosphere of fear and guilt. You staged the theft to flush out Barker, knowing he would panic and reveal himself. You poisoned Professor Whitmore when he grew suspicious of your activities. And finally, you murdered Barker in those woods to claim the prize you believed was rightfully yours. The final revelation. The evidence of your guilt extends beyond mere opportunity, mademoiselle. The poison used on Professor Whitmore was digitless, taken from Sir Montague's locked medicine cabinet. Only someone with regular access to his private quarters could have obtained it. The knife that killed Barker came from the conservatory toolshed, a location you visited regularly in your capacity as household manager. Miss Sterling stood slowly, her grey eyes blazing with years of suppressed fury. They deserved everything that happened to them. My father was the expedition's true scholar, yet Montague took all the credit, all the glory. We were forgotten, dismissed, left to struggle while he lived in luxury built on stolen treasures. And for that perceived injustice, Poirot said quietly, you were willing to commit murder, to destroy lives in pursuit of what you called divine justice. No, mademoiselle, what you sought was not justice, but revenge dressed in the robes of righteousness. Inspector Morrison stepped forward with his handcuffs as the full weight of the evidence settled over the room. Catherine Sterling, I'm arresting you for the murders of Charles Barker and the attempted murder of Professor James Whitmore. As they led her away, her final words echoed through the Egyptian room with chilling conviction. The scales of Ma'at have been balanced at last. The guilty have been punished, and the treasures of Egypt will return to their rightful home. Justice and reflection. Later, as we prepared to depart Ravenscroft Manor, Poirot stood once more before the ancient artifacts, his expression thoughtful and melancholy. The case is closed, Hastings, but the tragedy continues. Miss Sterling sought to weigh the hearts of others against the feather of truth, but in doing so, she made her own heart heavy with the weight of murder and betrayal. He adjusted his hat with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting the pale sunlight streaming through the windows. The eye of Isis returns to Egypt as it should, but the human cost of this ancient treasure will echo through the years to come. Justice, mon ami, is a delicate balance, and once disturbed by human hands, it rarely finds its equilibrium again. As we walked toward the waiting motor car, the morning mist finally lifted from the grounds of Ravenscroft Manor, revealing the estate in all its faded grandeur. Behind us, the house stood silent and watchful, its windows reflecting the sky like the unseeing eyes of ancient gods who had witnessed the folly of mortals and found them wanting. The affair of the Cairo sapphire letters was finished, but its lessons would linger long in the memory. A reminder that the greatest treasures often exact the highest price from those who covet them.